Welcome, adventurers. A clash of swords, a flash of lightning, and one poor goblin warrior instantly vaporized from the map. Who can combine the brutality of melee combat with the sophistication of the arcane arts? Only the Magus. Welcome to Rebel Then King. Today, we're talking about the martial caster, the Magus. It's a relatively new class, and I actually haven't played as one, nor have I played with one in any of my campaigns, but there was just recently a Hijinks episode where they played through a one-shot from Sinclair's library, and they did have a Magus in that group, so I've seen it enough-ish, and I really like the class and have read up about it and theory crafted tons of builds, so let's get into it. Also, Magus, Magus, Magus. I know there are lots of pronunciations. I'm going with Magus. I think Magus is technically correct, and I know it's magic with a J sound and not a G sound, but it's also not magic like Magus, so whatever. I'm going with Magus. It's what sounds good to me. Sorry. A Magus can use either strength or dexterity for their key ability score. They are trained in simple as well as martial weapons and have proficiency in light and medium armor with 8 hit points per level. They are trained into a number of skills equal to 2 plus their intelligence modifier plus arcana, so that's nice. And there are 5 subclasses which are called the hybrid studies. You've got Inexorable Iron, Laughing Shadow, Sparkling Targe, Starlit Span, and finally Twisting Tree. So the question with the Magus is always, are they a martial? Are they a caster? We'll talk about that. And yes, they are a bit martial and a bit magic, and that does make them a bit of a multiple attribute dependency class. Now, we talked about this a bit when we talked about clerics who want some charisma for their divine font, but they use wisdom for their spellcasting ability modifier. And usually being too mad or multiple attribute dependency is kind of bad. Being mad is bad. But as far as mad classes go, the Magus does pretty well. And this is sort of the first clue as to whether or not the Magus is a martial or a caster. You see, they use dexterity or strength as their key ability scores. Those are their martial scores. So you can kind of see here, you're already looking at wanting to hit stuff hard and then using your intelligence for spellcasting as sort of a secondary option. So speaking of hitting stuff and casting spells, how do you do that? And most importantly, how do you do that at the same time? Well, you use Spellstrike. This is more or less the defining feature of the Magus. It is 2 actions, and in those 2 actions, you both make a melee strike and cast a spell. Now, the spell must have the attack trait to it, so it does need to be any spell that would normally require an attack roll. So for 2 actions, you basically get 3 actions because it normally would be strike for 1 action and then cast that damaging spell for 2. And the way this works is if that melee strike hits, well, then you calculate the damage for the strike plus the spell all at once. Now, there are a lot of other details about Spellstrike, like how to deal with additional spell effects, but we're just going to skip over those because I want to talk about damage. Oh, the sweet damage of Spellstrike. First of all, you have access to martial weapons, and you can use strength as your key ability score. This means that you very well could be doing D12 plus 4 just on your melee attack. And then if you're using something like telekinetic projectile, you could be doing like a D6 plus 3 for the spell attack. That all combines to an average of 17 points of damage for 2 actions. That is massive. Additionally, depending on the spell that you're using, you could get around resistances or activate weaknesses on that enemy. And that is a huge advantage that you as the Magus have over other martials. One other important thing to talk about with Spellstrike is how to recharge it, because You can't just keep using it over and over. The first thing you can do is you can just take an action to recharge. I like that they built it in. You can Spellstrike, and then for your third action, you basically do nothing. It is recharging your Spellstrike. The other thing you can do is cast a Conflux spell. Conflux spells are a Magus' focus spell, and each hybrid study, each of the subclass options, has its own. I really like Thunder Strike. That is where you make a strike, but there is a cone of sonic damage behind it, and that is offered to you by the Inexorable Iron hybrid study. And then there's the Laughing Shadows Dimensional Assault. You actually teleport and make a melee strike. So you can see not only do these Conflux spells recharge Spellstrike, which is already great, but they're very nice on their own. And I like that each of them sort of has an element of magic and an element of martial in the Conflux spell itself. It really continues to fuse together these hybrid combinations of magic and martial abilities, and it really just paints the Magus as like an all-out offensive force on the battlefield. But wait, the Magus has even more capabilities that combine magic with martial. You see, after casting a spell, any spell, you can drop into your Arcane stance for one action, and then use Arcane Cascade. This will add 1 point of damage to each of your strikes while you remain in the stance. Now, the type of damage that is dealt is pretty easy to figure out typically. If you cast Produce Flame, well, you add fire damage. Acid Splash, you guessed it, acid. But this does work with any spell, like even Shield or Fear or Command. And they actually provide you with a nice lookup table to see what type of damage you should be adding. Typically, it's going to be adding some mental or force damage if it's one of those sort of non-elemental types of spells. And this can be really powerful if one of your enemies has a weakness to something. If you know something has a weakness to cold, for example, you could cast Ray of Frost. Then you drop into your stance, and then you start hitting that enemy with your weapon, but you add cold damage on top of it, activating that weakness with each one of your strikes. So we talked a lot about the hybrid abilities of the Magus, but what about their pure spellcasting? Well, here's where it's clear that they are not full spellcasters, because at level 1, they gain access to one level 1 spell. That's it. If you want to cast a lot of arcane spells, leave that up to the nerdy wizards. But in a way, I actually find this really limited number of spells kind of comforting. You see, when you are playing as a wizard or sorcerer where your spells from spell slots are really what make you powerful, I find myself very carefully rationing them and really being sort of hesitant on using them, trying to pick the best time, feeling like they're wasted if I don't use them at the right time or if they don't really have the effect that I wanted. But when you only have one, it's sort of a bonus. I mean, you concentrate first on being good with all of your hybrid abilities, and then you sort of have this one spell a day to, cast it and see what happens. If it works, great. If it doesn't, it's not that big of a loss. So how do you use this sort of hybrid build? Well, as we're kind of seeing, it really is more about martial than it is about magic when it comes to the Magus. And to me, that means front-line damage. Unless you play as the Starlit Span, which is the ranged option for the Magus, everything I've talked about where I've said a melee strike, well, that actually applies for ranged attacks if you are playing as Starlit Span. And with so many abilities geared towards doing big damage, I mean, that's your role, right? And I do find that the Magus is pretty successful in this damage role. Spellstrike hits hard, and when it crits, I mean, nothing will survive that. As we talked about, you can also get around resistances and activate weaknesses, and that's super helpful. You might struggle just a little bit, though, compared to something like a fighter or a barbarian who has just maybe a little bit more accuracy, or at the very least is going to be rolling the dice and making more attacks. You see, Spellstrike, yes, it hits hard, but as we talked about, it does need to recharge, So you might need to think ahead a little bit, really set up your shots, plan turn to turn so you can make sure to recharge that Spellstrike, get in position, set up your next shot, and do some damage. Well, there we have it. I think the Magus is just a brilliantly designed class. I really like all of the hybrid abilities on their own, but more so, I like the way that they complement each other. Spellstrike, you use that, and then you recharge it with Conflux Spells. And then after either of those, you could go into your Arcane Cascade stance and, apply additional damage. It is just so fantastic that these aren't unique individual things they can do, but it's sort of a feature set of tools that work together to make your Magus. I have a few Magus builds that I just can't wait to try out. It is very, very high on my list for whenever I start my new campaign. And even though I haven't played as one yet, haven't even had one in one of my campaigns yet, I still feel pretty comfortable giving the Magus 8 out of 10 crying GMs after Spellstrike critically hits. Seriously, it does so much damage. But who of you out there has played as a Magus? Do you agree with me about the spell slots? Did you find it kind of freeing? Or was it somewhat limited and frustrating? Let me know in the comments. Until then, keep showing up both the wizard and the barbarian in your party because you've got the best of both of their worlds. Just don't let the barbarian make fun of you too much for how ridiculously long the rulebook entry on Spellstrike is. It's complex. I skipped it for a reason.